Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most talked about, most mysterious numbers in the entire Bible, the 144,000. But the interpretation we're looking at today, well, it's not your standard Sunday school lesson. According to our source material, the answer isn't a simple list of names. No, it's hidden in architecture, in numerology, and in a pretty shocking claim about the true nature of angels. All right, so let's just get right to it. The big question. The book of Revelation talks about 144,000 people, sealed from the tribes of Israel, who stand on Mount Zion. Now, for centuries, Bible students have debated who these people are. Are they literal descendants of Jacob? Is it just a symbolic number for the church? The theory we're digging into today suggests something completely different. You know, to really get this theory, you have to put on your code breaker hat. Our source argues that the number 144,000 isn't just a head count. It's a deeply coded symbol, and the keys to unlocking it are actually scattered all throughout the Old and New Testaments. Yeah, this is not about just one or two verses. It's about connecting this whole web of symbols, from scripture, numerology, and even a bit of history. Think of it like a detective's case, where each clue builds on the last, and it all leads to a really wild conclusion. So, let's follow the evidence. So where does this whole investigation kick off? Well, you might be surprised. It's not in the book of Revelation. We have to rewind way back to the Old Testament, to the construction of Solomon's temple. And we need to focus on two massive, really interesting objects, a pair of bronze columns.
According to this interpretation, these two pillars are the master key to the whole thing. The idea is that they weren't just for decoration. They were a physical prophecy, a blueprint cast in bronze for a very specific group of people who would show up thousands of years later.
And here's where you can see the direct parallel the source is drawing. See, just like those columns stood as witnesses right at the entrance to the temple, the 144,000 are seen as spiritual pillars who stand before God. And those pomegranates that were all over the columns, the theory says they symbolize the nations of the world, the very people this group is meant to testify to. And this pattern, this idea of two, just keeps popping up. The source connects the two columns to all these other important pairs in the Bible. You've got the two witnesses and the two lampstands in Revelation, the two main hills of Jerusalem, and even the two kinds of rods Jacob used as a witness in his deal with Laban. It's all about duality and testimony. Okay, so we've got the core symbol down, but this theory isn't just about imagery. It uses a really specific, step-by-step calculation to get from two bronze columns all the way to 144,000 people. So let's walk through the math. All right, the first piece of this puzzle is a Jewish concept called a minyan. It's basically the smallest group you need, 10 men, to form a proper congregation for prayer. And in this theory, the number 10 becomes the foundational spiritual building block for the entire group. Now, the calculation actually starts with the number 72. And you might be asking, where in the world did they get 72? Well, it's a little complicated, but the author argues that if you calculate the hollow volume of both bronze columns, you actually end up with the number 72. And that number is then linked to other key groups of 72 in the Bible, like the elders that Moses appointed.
Okay, let's just trace the steps here. According to the source, you start with those 72 delegations. You multiply that by 200, which represents the nations of the world symbolized by the pomegranates. That gets you to 14,400. This number is seen as the total number of minions, right? These groups of 10. So you multiply that by 10, and boom, you land exactly on 14,400 individuals.
So what's the point of all this math? It's not just about getting to a cool number. The source argues that it actually describes a real-world organizational structure, a massive network of 7,200 key cities all across the globe, with each city having a team of 20 people, that's 2 minions, acting as official witnesses.
So now that we have this structure, the theory starts pulling in even more biblical symbols to really flesh out the role of this group. We're moving from columns to witnesses to oxen, and believe it or not, even to human anatomy.
First up, they're identified as the famous two witnesses from Revelation. But here's the twist. It's not just two people. It's the entire group of 144,000 spread out globally. And that's why each city gets 2 minions. It perfectly fulfills the biblical law that says any testimony has to be established by at least 2 witnesses. The next symbol comes from another piece of Solomon's temple, those 12 bronze oxen that held up that huge basin of water known as the Bronze Sea. In this interpretation, the sea represents rebellious humanity, and the 144,000 are like these oxen, facing all four corners of the world to spiritually support it and hold it accountable.
And then the symbolism takes this really fascinating turn, shifting from temple architecture to the human body. The source makes this amazing analogy, connecting the 144,000 to the human rib cage. It portrays them as this living, breathing, protective structure for Christ's interests here on earth.
Let's break this down. It's simple, but powerful. Just like our ribs protect our heart, the 144,000 are seen as a spiritual defense. But the analogy goes even deeper. You remember how Eve was created from Adam's rib to be a suitable helper? Well, this theory suggests the 144,000 are formed to be a suitable helper for Christ during his future reign. Okay, everything we've talked about so far, the columns, the numbers, all the symbols, it's all been leading up to this one single point. And honestly, this is by far the most radical, the most mind-bending claim in the entire theory. It challenges the very definition of who, or maybe I should say what, the 144,000 actually are. The whole argument pivots back to one of the most mysterious and debated passages in the entire Bible, Genesis chapter 6. This is that story of the sons of God and the daughters of men, an event that many people interpret as a forbidden interaction between angels and humans that led to massive corruption right before the Great Flood.
So that ancient event sets up the theory's central question. Think about it. If an angelic intervention was part of humanity's fall, could a different kind of angelic intervention be part of its redemption? It kind of frames what's coming next as this massive cosmic course correction.
And here it is, the central claim of this whole interpretation. The 144,000 are not human, not at all. According to this theory, they are holy angels who will actually be born of women, taking on human form to carry out a very specific mission here on earth.
The theory presents this as a kind of perfect spiritual counterbalance. The first angelic intervention back in Genesis was an act of rebellion, of corruption. This second one is an act of perfect obedience and purification. Where the first angels took wives illegally, these remain virgins. They enter the world legally through birth to reverse the damage that was done so long ago. So you have to ask, why angels? Well, the source gives a few reasons. The idea that the columns were hollow is said to represent spirits. The powers they have in Revelation, like calling down fire, mirror angelic abilities. And maybe most importantly, Revelation says they follow the Lamb wherever he goes. This theory takes that literally, meaning they follow him all the way from heaven down to earth. This, of course, leads to a very difficult and sobering question. How would these angels actually be born? The source puts forward a very specific and frankly pretty disturbing scenario. It speculates that during a future prophesied attack on Jerusalem, God will perform a miracle, bringing redemption out of a great tragedy. That children conceived through the violence of that war will be divinely transformed in the womb, becoming these holy, angelic beings born to Jewish women. So, we've gone through who the source claims they are, and the pretty controversial idea of how they come to be, but let's finish by looking at their ultimate purpose. What is the final destiny of these 144,000? Their journey is laid out like a timeline that, in many ways, mirrors the story of Christ himself. First, there's a 1,260-day ministry as witnesses across the whole globe. Then, that ministry ends in their death. They're martyred by the figure known as the Beast. But after 3.5 days, they are publicly resurrected and ascend into heaven right before the final judgments fall. And finally, they return with Christ to rule during the 1,000-year kingdom. And their ultimate destiny is right there in Revelation. They make this incredible transition from witnesses and martyrs to becoming priests and kings, serving directly alongside Christ for his 1,000-year reign on earth. They basically become the administrative pillars of his new government. And this gives them one final absolutely crucial role. They become a living, walking test for all of humanity. The source draws a parallel to how Rahab was saved for helping the 2 spies in Jericho. In the same way, it argues the world's final judgment will hinge on how it treats these 144,000 witnesses. Showing them mercy becomes the key to receiving mercy from God. And that brings our explanation to a close. We've traced this incredibly fascinating and, let's be honest, unconventional theory, one that identifies the 144,000 as angels, using temple architecture as a blueprint and numerology as a guide. It's a complex system, and it leaves us with one last question to think about. Whatever you believe about prophecy, what does the drive to create such an intricate, all-encompassing explanation tell us about our own deep human need to find patterns, meaning, and a hidden order in the sacred mysteries of the world?